My grandfather grew up on a chicken farm outside of Krakow, Poland. He passed away a few years ago at the age of 82. A few days before his passing on, due to an aggressive form of stomach cancer, he sat down next to me and he told me in his familiar Polish accent, "After I took the boat to New York, I promised to leave the story behind." He didn't look up to me as he spoke, simply staring into his black cup of coffee. It's been 70 years, and I must tell someone before I meet God. I was born in a small, quaint, empty town, which, despite Nazi occupation, still functioned. We lived in this 2-bedroom farmhouse, my father, mother, and my brothers Michael and Igor. I'm sorry, but you never got to meet any of them. Anyway, Michael and Igor were twins, identical twins actually, and we had heard the rumors of the Nazi fascination with identical twins. This forced us, and we already lived in a secluded part of the countryside, in the last occupied house in the town, to be even more reserved. In order to not go into the occupied towns, we basically ate only chicken and eggs for every meal, and whatever Mama could gather from the garden. It was lonely, but we survived. The only two things that were really hard on me were the fact that I had to sleep in the basement. Due to Michael and Igor being toddlers, they required my father and mother's attention. The basement was cold, and the only light I got came from a small window. Because of this, I always delayed going down there until I was absolutely exhausted, so I wouldn't have to lie there awake. On the nights that I couldn't manage to sleep, I would look out the window, which gave me a small view of the garden and a large abandoned water well. This was my daily activity throughout these lonely, war-torn nights. In general, it was boring and uneventful, but occasionally, I would catch a glimpse of a family, or even a man or two lovers sneaking their way through the garden up to our front door. They always looked rushed and frightened, and sometimes they wore tattered uniforms. What would follow were the horrible sounds of banging and pleading for whoever lived there to open up, followed by an argument between my father and my mother over whether we should let them in. He moved in the chair to adjust himself. "You see, son, we didn't know it, or at least I didn't, but we lived very close to Auschwitz concentration camp, and the people were escapees." "Well, did your father let them in?" I asked impatiently. "No," he said. "It would have been a death sentence for them as well as for us. The Nazis didn't like the Poles, but they tolerated us, and it was easier to hide Michael or Igor than the entire family. My father did what he had to do in order to keep his family alive." As the war went on, less and less people began showing up in the middle of the night. Only our chicken and vegetables started to disappear. Losing our only supply of food would not have been possible, and at this point my father knew it was probably the escapees, so he built a fence around our property. Despite this, the chickens continued to disappear. They weren't killed, they were simply gone. Just vanished from their cages and pens. One night, I decided to stay up myself in order to see if I could find out the answer. I battled my tiredness until the wee hours of the morning, and despite the poor lightning and rain, I caught a glimpse of what seemed to be a human figure run across the garden. I rushed upstairs to tell my father, and he ran outside with a knife, the best home defense weapon he could afford, but we found nothing. No one. The next day, we did find something though, footprints, leading from the chicken cages to the water well. They were made in wet mud from the rain, and they were of bare feet, no shoes and no socks, just feet. My father had mercy on the man who was trying to find refuge and left them a note, indicating that he had 2 days to leave, and then we would begin to seal the well. I waited impatiently for my grandfather to tell me the fate of the man. The following night, I conjured up the idea to take a blanket down to the well and the man, since the winter was creeping in. I waited until my parents were asleep, and I snuck outside. I shouted down to the well something friendly, indicating to the poor man my intentions were benign, and I began my descent, hands and feet clinging to the pegs which were attached to the stones. As I approached to the bottom, I smelled something absolutely horrific, and pulled my father's flashlight from my pocket to try to shine it on the man, coming to the realization of just how large the well was, since it was used to supply water for the entire town and its families which no longer remained. But I found no man, only a hole in stone, where the wall of the well had collapsed, opening some type of crevice, only 2 meters wide and 3 meters deep and tall. Inside sat not a man. Inside was a family, with only a skeleton-like creature as the only survivor. The light reflected off his skunken eyes and grayish skin, face covered in blood, with chicken carcasses scattered around, a pile of decomposing chickens, next to a woman, a son, a daughter, and the children who must have barely been 5 years old, and they seemed to have been dead for weeks. The man, if he could be called that, just stared at the light, and I stared at him back, incapable of breaking the stare. I did not feel threatened by him, for he lacked any sense of aggression. He simply sat there, crouched over, without a sound, next to the putrefying body of his loved ones, and the chickens he could have only been using as his source of water, and their meat was not eaten. He was empty, devoid of whatever in us makes us human. He should have ever realized his family was dead long ago, but he was still bringing them food for their corpses. He couldn't accept it. He did finally turn his head, though, when I shined the light back into the corpse of his daughter. He stared at her, sat down closer to her, and continued to stare. "You can leave now. I'll open the gate so you can escape. My father will seal the well in the morning," I said to him. "Please leave now." My young voice and advice didn't seem to have any effect on him. At this moment, I decided it would be better for me just to climb back up the well and leave. Hopefully the man would follow and escape. As I began the climb, I shined the light on him one final time. "What did you see, Grandpa?" I shuddered. A tear fell from his eye. He had become a man once again. He broke free from the delusion, only when he saw the body of his dead daughter, which had been hidden by the darkness. He realized he had been bringing food, not to his family, but to their corpses. That night it rained again, but I found no footprints leaving the well in the morning when my father sealed it.